In order to make a pair of boots of this sort, you're going to need a number of tools. A tack hammer, possibly a magnetic one, would be a very useful tool. A pair of dedicated lasting pliers, which have a curved face and may sometimes incorporate a hammer face and a nail puller, will make your job much easier. Additional tools like a small pair of needle nose pliers, high quality shears, and a nail puller, which can be made from a screwdriver with a V-shaped notch filed into the tip, will be critical for performing an operation of this sort. In addition, you may want to find a razor blade or an X-Acto knife, and you'll need some contact cement. Another tool you can't do without is the iron last. This is used for securing the nails which will hold your sole in place.
Today what we're going to make is a costume reconstruction of a pair of shoes found in the Viking city of York. It's very similar to shoe number 138 in the book Primitive Shoes by Margaret Hall. This type of shoe is actually more properly called a boot, although it only goes up to the ankle. I said we were going to be making costume reconstructions, as we've done in the other videos in this series. By costume reconstruction, I mean that we will not be copying this piece exactly. What we're going to do is use some modern shoemaking techniques in order to produce a boot that will work very well for living history people. Medieval shoes, Viking shoes, would not have had hard soles because medieval people's feet were much more used to walking on rocks and sharp sticks. But we just aren't. Therefore, we have to use a slightly thicker sole. I'm not going to use soles as thick as you'd find on modern shoes, but certainly thicker than those you would find on medieval shoes. We're also going to use modern shoemaking techniques in order that we can produce these shoes a little quicker. The first step in making boots of this sort is to lay out your pattern pieces in such a way that you use the minimum amount of leather possible. I've got these pieces laid out so that they almost touch, and they're laid out on a piece of nice supple oil-tanned leather. I'll cut them out and put them upstairs in the sink to soak for about a half an hour. When I come back, I will also have laid out the insole and the sole and cut them out as well. In order to make this type of shoe, you'll need to have a wooden last. A wooden last can be found any number of places: antique stores, flea markets, or even shoe repair stores. Wooden lasts come in a variety of sizes and shapes. It's important that you get the exact right size for your foot, and that the toe shape is correct. In the case of a pair of Viking shoes, the toe shapes will be rounded, and that's pretty easy to come by. If you can't find a rounded toed last, simply do as I have done, and that is, make it round. This pair of lasts originally had boot toes, which were rather square and blocky. I simply took a file and filed them until they were the right shape. At this point, I'm ready to take my vamp and stretch it over the last. What I'd like to do is center it so that the piece fits nice and even over the entire vamp, and make sure that the highest point on the last is covered by my vamp piece. Put it back on my post, try to get it as even as possible, and start stretching the leather from both sides. I'll put a nail in the instep first, because there's the least stretching there. And then I'll place one in the opposite position on the other side of the last. Then do the same thing with the other end of the instep, right over here. Place one nail in and hammer it home. Then put one in the middle, trying to stretch it as much as you can each time you move the piece, or each time you put in a nail. Then what you're going to want to do is find your lasting pliers, if you have a pair, and stretch the other side over. The other side of the last, the side away from the instep, has the most stretch needed because of the concavity of the outside of the foot. Now, you'll need to be sure that you get it stretched as tightly as you possibly can. You notice I'm using the hammer side of my lasting plier simply because it's handy. I needed all my hands to make sure that I could get the piece stretched across the leather. I didn't have the ability to switch to another hammer. Okay, now I'm pulling it across and out slightly. I'm doing the same thing. Okay, at this point I have 3 nails in the back area. What I'm going to want to do is pull the toe in, and the same process is used here. Grab the leather, pull forward and up. Try to stretch it as much as you possibly can, because the more you stretch it, the better off you'll be. This is simply to allow the leather to conform to the shape of the last as best it can. Now in this case I'm using a separate hammer because I need to keep the leather stretched with the lasting pliers. I now have the toe tacked in place. What I want to do is move these areas in. You don't have to follow this order. If you want, you can start at the back of the shoe and work your way up to the toe and pull it back. I simply like this method because I'm used to it. Any order that you want to use will work equally well, I think. And get them hammered home. At this point, we're pretty tightly stretched across the last. That's what our leather is. So I want to work towards the toe a little bit. Try to get as much of that leather taken in as possible. You'll also notice right now I have what I would call ears sticking out from the front. That's no problem. We'll take care of that in a minute. I want to pull the leather back as much as possible because the less material I have at the toe, the better off I am. So right now what I'm going to try to do, actually instead of putting a nail here, I'm going to try to pull some of these ears back. Now I may not be able to do it with a regular set of lasting pliers, but I have to go to a set of needle nose pliers. Grab the leather. Oops. Unfortunately, needle nose pliers don't have the right kind of teeth for gripping leather, and so it tends to slip a little bit more. Okay, I've taken this one ear and divided it into 2, and I'm going to do the same thing for the other side. Same thing goes. Now I'm going to work this area back. Just going to use my hands to pull it back because I've given the leather almost all the stretch that I can possibly give it. And I'll do the same thing for this area right here. We now have a number of smaller bubbles, which is good. It's not good that we have bubbles, but it's good that they're smaller. And work our way through the shoe. Now you don't have to be absolutely religious about getting every little ripple out. This little bump won't hurt a thing. It's way back in the middle of the shoe. But bumps like this, this, and this are major problems, and they can cause your shoe to look bad or to fit improperly, and you don't want that. So the way to take care of a bubble, any bubble, is to put a nail in the middle of it. And also as far in towards the center of the last as possible. Alright, now there's still some rippling up here, but it's not the kind of thing I can't take care of with a razor blade and smooth it out. And there's a few other little ripples, but they're not worth worrying about. Next, what I need to do is put the quarters on, which I'll do when I come back. I'm now ready to put my quarters piece on. Quarters piece is placed so that the point wraps around to the instep, or towards the instep. I've placed the piece on using exactly the same theory I used for the other piece. Started by placing the piece nice and centered, taking 2 nails and putting them here and here, stretching the leather as much as possible. I then put one in the center back and created two large bubbles, which I then took down, just as you did in the toe, into several smaller bubbles. What I'm going to do now is get rid of some of those other smaller bubbles. Remember the theory, split one big bubble into two small bubbles, and then a small bubble into two smaller ripples. And that's pretty straightforward. It's not difficult at all. Basically, right now, we have a finished shoe. This would wrap around, and there's a little toggle here, and that's what the shoe will look like. There's a little notch, and all this is very correct. Our shoe right now is ready to dry overnight. I'll do the same thing with the other shoe, and we'll see you tomorrow. Now that my pieces have sat on the laths overnight, what I need to do is remove them. And this is a pretty simple operation. All you have to do is pull all the nails. One more to go after this one. Here we go. Here's the last nail. Okay, this piece is removable. I can set it aside. And this piece is removable. You notice how the vamp has taken on all of the characteristics of the wooden shape, or the wooden form. This is the sweep here, the high point, and the exact contours of the round toe. So be careful when you're rounding the toe on your last that you don't have any gouges in it. Otherwise those will show up on your finished product. While my leather was drying, I cut out my insoles. I also cut out my soles. Okay, I've taken 3 nails, placed one in the back, one in the front, and one in the center. These are simply to hold it in place while I glue the shoe together. Gluing the shoe together is a fairly simple process. All you do is you take some contact cement, coat the pieces, and let it set up, which is what I'm going to do. What I want to do is take it and try to avoid getting strings. Strings are little bits of glue that come from the jar and they can mess up your finished product. What I want to do is spread it evenly in a nice thin coat across the outer edge of the insole. Try not to get any on the last. If you get any on the last, it may make your shoe difficult to remove. And that wouldn't be any fun. You want this to go as easily as possible. I'll also coat the inside edges of the vamp and the heel cup. Let's get this out of the way. I'm going to coat all of the area in here where the leather touched the bottom of the last. 2 thin coats of glue is much better than 1 thick coat. It dries quicker, it's less likely to lump up on you, and I think it produces a much nicer finished appearance because there's less of a chance of getting it on the outside of the shoe. If you're only putting on a thin coat, it means your brush isn't covered in glue. Okay, I've coated the inside here. I'll do the same thing to the inside edges of the vamp, and then I'll let it dry, which is where we'll be when I come back. At this point, all of my glue has had a chance to set up, and it's had 2 coats. So what I'm going to do is very carefully slip the piece on, and I want to concentrate first on getting the toe just right, because if the toe isn't right, the shoe won't look right. So I want to be careful not to touch the 2 glued sections together, the 2 parts that are coated in glue, because otherwise they'll stick. That's how contact cement works. There we go. Coming along nicely. You want to be sure that you pull it all to exactly where you want it, so otherwise the toe or the rest of the shoe won't wind up looking right. Now that we have it all in place, I'm going to hammer it lightly so that the glue is set. And I'll do the same thing for the other piece. Slip it around. and put it in place. When it's set in place, by the way, you notice the heel's much easier. Hammer it home. Now what I want to do is deal with some of these wrinkles out here. It's a term called skiving. And what you do is take something very sharp, like a razor. Now I happen to be using just a regular old razor blade. And I'm very carefully slicing off this sort of bubble of leather. You want to be sure that you don't cut all the way through the leather, just enough to make it flush with the rest of the shoe. There we go. It's coming along nicely. We have all these pieces glued together. The shoe is basically set. What I want to do now is pull the 3 nails. It's very important that you remember to pull the 3 nails, otherwise you'll never get the shoe off the last. At this point, we have what is basically our formed shoe. They'll be toggled over here, and we're basically ready to take the next step, which is the creation of the slip sole. The slip sole is the portion that fills the gap between the insole and the sole, which is what we'll do when I come back. At this point, with the shoe entirely glued together, you're ready to make a slip sole. Now your slip sole can be made out of any material. Cork is a good one. Unfortunately, I'm out of it right now, so I'm just going to use another piece of leather. The primary concern of the slip sole is to fill up this space, the amount of room from the insole to the sole, evenly. And really, virtually anything will do it. It also makes the shoe a little more cushiony if you happen to have a piece of thin cork. But as I've said, I don't have any, so I'm just going to go ahead and use leather. In order to make a pattern for your slip sole, take an old piece of paper, this is just a bit of brown paper bag, and lay it on your shoe. Take your thumbnail and try to find the edges of the piece of leather. There should be a very definite ridge. And what you can do is take a pencil and help yourself to define where that ridge is. There, I have made a pattern that when transferred to leather will fit exactly into this space, and that'll give us a nice perfect piece to make, which is what I'll do when we come back. Now that I have a piece that fits very nicely into this opening, what I'm going to do is coat the bottom of this with a coat of glue, or 2 coats actually, and the inside of this with 2 coats of glue. When they've gotten tacky, I'll stick them together. Be very careful when you're doing this not to get any glue on the top of the shoe. This will show up. It doesn't matter if you get a little out here, that's not going to hurt anything. You are going to coat that eventually with glue. But you want to be sure that you don't get any down on the visible portions, because that would be very bad. It's tough to remove the glue from the external surfaces. There are such things as contact cement removers and thinners, but they don't really work all that well. So be careful. That's the easy solution. Same process, coat the inside of your slip sole with a nice thin coat of glue, not a thick one, but a thin one. And when they've set up, when the glue has become tacky, then you're ready to slip it in, which is what I'll do when we come back. Now that the glue has had a chance to get tacky, it's time to put it in place. Remember, when you're positioning pieces that have been coated with rubber cement, press them lightly into place first. That way you can adjust them, and then you can give it some pressure. Because if you give it pressure, you never get the pieces apart. See, now I'm pressing it down, and these pieces are permanently joined. The next step is to coat the inside of the sole, that is the rough side, and the inside, well, the bottom of the shoe, not the inside of the shoe. That'd be awfully messy. Okay, now the entire bottom of this shoe is coated with glue, as is the sole. I've already coated it. What I'm going to do is let them sit, give them 2 coats, and when they are tacky, I'll pull this off the last and put it onto the iron last so that I can put the sole on. That's one option. The other option, of course, is to stick the insole or the sole on while your shoe is still on the wooden last. If your sole is nice and flexible, like this one, then that's not a problem. However, if your sole is stiff and hard, like this one, don't try it. Wait until after you've removed it from the wooden last to put your sole on. And that's what we'll do when we come back. Okay, now that the glue's had a chance to get tacky on both sides of the piece, I just stick it together, very carefully laying it lightly over the piece. If it's not exactly right, adjust it slightly. Now that it's right, press it into place and hammer it with my wooden mallet. You don't have to have a wooden mallet for that. Now what I want to do is remove it from the last. I do that by breaking the last, that is to say, bending it at its joint, and then peeling the piece off. Now I have what is basically the finished shoe, except the sole is not attached permanently. In order to do that, I transfer it to my iron last over here. This is a round-toed iron last, just as I bought it from the flea market. And I'm ready to start nailing. I'm using, once again, 1 ounce nails, just like I always use. Pick any place on the entire shoe to start. Maybe I'll start with the back of it, with the heel. Put a nail in, hammer it straight down. When the nail, with its tiny thin point, comes in contact with the iron last, it turns back onto itself and forms basically a staple. And I'm spacing these nails a little over ½ inch apart. Any kind of a spacing that you want to use will work. I kind of like ½ inch. I sometimes use 3/4 inch. I sometimes use 1/4 inch. It really doesn't matter. In this particular case, I like this spacing. I'm not measuring them. If you wanted to, you could go ahead and make sure that each nail is placed exactly right. But I'm doing it by eye, and I find that my shoes wind up looking just fine when they're done by eye. And besides, it gives them more of a handmade look. Now I've come to the point where I've run into the double thicknesses of leather. So I've gone ahead and taken some longer nails. These are 2 ounce nails. And I'm going to go ahead and nail them home as well. Just going through the double layers of leather, I find oftentimes a good idea to make sure you've got enough nail. Now as you saw, that nail went in crooked. So I'm just going to pull it out. A nail that goes in crooked will never clinch. Clinching means turning back onto itself like a staple. So I'm going to try to reuse the same hole and push it forward. In that particular case, it works just fine. Here we go. As I work towards the toe, I want to be sure that I have enough nails. So what I'm going to do is tighten up my nail spacing. Take it from ½ inch to something less than that. Maybe 1/3 inch. I don't want to go quite to 1/4 inch. That would be a little extreme. At some points, in maybe a pointed toe shoe, I might want to have 1/4 inch spacing. But for this shoe, I think maybe 1/3 inch would be just fine. Okay, I now have what is essentially a finished shoe. And if it weren't a pair of boots, that would be all there was to do to it. Except, in this particular case, I'm making a boot. And there's a toggle that needs to be put on, which is what I'll do when we come back. In order to make your toggle, take a piece of your leather of the same type you're using for the rest of the shoe and cut it to the shape of the pattern piece for the toggle. Then coat the inside, the rough side, that is the flesh side, with 1 layer and let it dry of contact cement, then another layer and let it dry. When the glue has gotten tacky, you're ready to fold the piece in half. When it's folded in half, oops, take your piece of, you take your pattern piece for the toggle and trace it out. This should give you a nicely shaped piece. All you have to do is take an X-Acto and cut along these lines. When that's done, it's time to make the square hole or oval hole in the top. Now I happen to have a tubular punch that's shaped exactly right for it. So what I'm going to do is put a hole in it, and I'm going to actually put two holes side by side to make it easier to pull the piece through. I've now created a rectangular hole, a little thing in the middle. There we go. I can theoretically pull this through that hole and turn the material back onto itself. This is a toggle. It's pretty straightforward, pretty easy to make, not difficult at all. It's through this, it's through the means of this, that you will fasten your shoes. And that's really all there is to it. In order to attach it to your shoe, it's pretty simple. Take your shoe, take this tongue part, place it on your piece of end grain block, make a similar hole. Then all you have to do is fish this through it and stitch it down. This will make it permanently attached to your shoe, and it's by means of this that the loop, which will be our next stage, will hold your shoe closed. Cut out a piece of leather based on the thong pattern and tie a knot in one end. In order to make the loop, all you do is thread it through this hole. By the way, I've made two holes here as marked on the pattern. Once I have it threaded through, I bring it through the other hole and I tie a knot on the inside. I then can bring the loop around, or the toggle around in the tongue, slide it through. My shoe is now fastened as it will be when it's worn. And that's really all there is to it. That's one of the two shoes completely made. You notice that it's stitched up here in order to hold it in place. And I haven't tied the second knot yet, but I will as soon as I get off camera. And then all I have to do is finish the other shoe and I'll be basically done. Well, here we go. One pair of Viking boots, similar to those found at Hungate, York, about 9th or 10th century. And I think they're pretty easy to make. The only difference that I did, the only change that I made in copying the patterns, is this seam doesn't exist on the real shoes. It's all one piece. But I find this is much easier to make, and also it produces a much more watertight boot, which for people who do living history and walk around in the mud is rather important. That's really all there is to it. It's a very simple project. As you can see, it only took me a couple hours. And I hope you try it. Good luck and happy shoemaking.